This presentation is about the Valley of the Drums environmental disaster which took place in Bullitt County, Kentucky. Valley of the Drums is formally referred to as the A.L. Taylor Superfund site. The purpose of this presentation is to highlight what happened in the site as well as the impact it had on the way environmental disasters of this sort are handled in the U.S. After this presentation, I hope you will have an understanding of the Valley of the Drums and how it led to the Superfund Act, or CERCLA, which stands for the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act. This is a picture of the Valley of the Drums when it was still a dump site. This is a brief overview of the presentation. It's going to include a couple of figures, a summary, and the references at the end. This table is derived from the EPA's website about the A.L. Taylor Superfund site. The current performance measures its status and what the status means. This table gives us an idea of what progress the cleanup efforts have made, and you can see that human exposure is under control, groundwater migration is under control, construction of cleanup structures are complete, but the site is not yet ready for any anticipated use. So what exactly happened? Starting the late 60s, the site was used as an unregulated industrial waste dump, primarily with drums full of waste from the nearby paint industry. Mostly solvents which can have various chemicals in different concentrations all within these waste drums. More than 100,000 drums were deposited into the site over 10 years. In 1975, the Kentucky Natural Resources and Environmental Protection Cabinet got involved after getting reports from locals of a fire burning for over a week from the drums and films of solvent over the creek causing an irritating chemical smell. In 1979, the EPA started an emergency response to contain the migration of the hazardous materials. Investigation about the scope of the contamination, cleanup, and monitoring continued in the 80s and 90s, and in 1996, the site was finally removed from the national priorities list. The site continues to be monitored every 5 years. So now let's take a look at how the cleanup was actually organized and what structures needed to be built. This is an aerial view of the site. As we can see, the legend indicates where they put the clay cap to contain the migration of migration of chemicals seeping through into a larger area. They also dug wells to monitor the groundwater, and they also installed a drainage system around the perimeter. A security fence was also installed to limit public access to the contaminated site. So in terms of actual contamination, the drums actually deteriorated, causing the waste to spill into the ground and seep into the soil and contaminate the groundwater. The surface runoff flowed into Wilson Creek, which flows into Pond Creek, which drains into Salt River, which then confluences with the Ohio River. Potable or drinkable water was not contaminated, but the spillage created films on top of the water bodies and emits fumes which cause irritation. One of the most dangerous compounds in the waste is PCBs, or polychlorinated biphenyls, which are highly toxic to the environment as well as human health. They can potentially cause cancer and impact multiple organ systems. The general routes of exposure include ingestion, inhalation, and dermal contact. Here is a bar graph depicting the levels of one of the PCB constituents known as Arochlor 1245 in the years 2019 and 2020. And you can see that they exceed the set industrial and residential soil levels. Despite these high levels, it was determined by the EPA that sediment removal is not necessary but should be monitored periodically. So what is CERCLA? It stands for the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act. The urgent need to clean up Valley of the Drums in an organized, swift, and safe way was a major factor in this law being enacted in 1980. This is a line graph depicting the fluctuation of the EPA's Superfund program annual appropriations for fiscal years 1999 through 2013. The value of the dollar is constant based on the 2013 dollar adjusted for inflation. The tax on the petroleum and chemical industries that funds the cleanup have been subjected to political turmoil. Lack of inadequate funding slows the pace of cleanup when these hazardous events occur, and the fund was approaching depletion, threatening the ability of the EPA to sustain its Superfund cleanup operations. In 2021, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act reauthorized an excise tax on chemical manufacturers, and emergency allocations were also approved for the EPA to conduct immediate site cleanups. However, it is still underfunded. Some key takeaways that we can learn from the Valley of the Drums include that industries must have accountability to safely handle and dispose of waste in order to avoid public and environmental harm. The necessity of local and federal organizations to work together to step in and coordinate cleanup processes is also highlighted by this event. It's important to note that this event could have been much more hazardous for human health, and that a major catastrophe was actually avoided because there were no casualties as a result of this. But it is possible that long-term exposure to contamination in the surrounding area contributed to health complications in local residents and workers. I would also like to emphasize the importance of the EPA's continued funding and taxing the petroleum and chemical industry to ensure continued funding of CERCLA and to encourage proactive waste management practices to prevent environmental disasters. These are some of the sources used to generate the figures in this presentation, and I hope you're now more informed about the Valley of the Drums and the Superfund Act. Thank you for listening.